Well, good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome. My name is Professor Jocelyn Chey. I am the director of the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University. Together with my colleague and friend, Professor Jing Han, from the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture, it is our pleasure to be able to welcome each of you here to this very special event, to hear from the Honourable Kevin Rudd AC, 26th Prime Minister of Australia, in conversation with Professor Jocelyn Chey AM about his new book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. We are joined this evening by many distinguished guests from the diplomatic corps, both past and present, current and former judicial officers, those who have or are serving in local, state and federal government, for Western Sydney University, and last and certainly not least, friends from the wider community. Welcome all. Friends, Matilda Harry, a young, proud academic, award-winning Wiradjuri scholar, currently a PhD candidate with the Graduate Research School at Western Sydney University, will now welcome us to country. Matilda is passionate about creating positive social change through education and is achieving this through her community activism, her public engagements, her board memberships, and as a volunteer in numerous grassroots community programs. Her doctoral research focuses upon Indigenous youth success and mentorship. Matilda.
Yamadamarang, everyone. Yuan Nadi Matilda Harry. Baladu Wiradjuri, Gibia Malanya Ninya, Badu Giliang Wiradjuri Narambang. Good evening, the Honourable Kevin Rudd, members of the Whitlam Board, leaders, members of the Australian Chinese community, members of Western Sydney University's professoriate, and guests. Wow, this is such an exciting event. As you know, my name's Matilda, and I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman with ancestral and spiritual connections to Goanna country, Gugar country, in central west New South Wales. The language I spoke earlier is my language, Wiradjuri language, and I speak it today with permission from my elders and Darug elders as a way to pay respects to those who pass it on to us young ones. I'm lucky enough to know some of you, but for those who don't know me, I'm a proud Aboriginal Australian woman, a daughter, granddaughter, brother, sister, auntie, partner. I'm also an educator, a writer and a PhD candidate. Tonight we meet on the ancestral home of the Barramadigal peoples of the Darug Nation. And this is really special Nora to me because this is where I was born and I continue to live, study and work. So I pay my utmost respects to Darug ancestors, peoples, lands and waterways. Darug elders are really strong and resilient and generous as they continue to share the dreaming of this country. So tonight I thought I would share some interesting information about the country that we're on to help us connect, considering that the Parramatta River runs parallel to where we are now, as it actually borders our campus. Darug elders note that the name Parramatta actually means where the eels lay down, and since creation, the short-finned eels have migrated from the Parramatta River out to sea, with recent research documenting them travelling as far as Papua New Guinea and New Caledonia, where the adults breed, lay their eggs, and then they die. And when the babies hatch, they instinctively swim all the way back home to the home of their parents, the Parramatta River, and they stay there until they're ready to make the journey themselves, in which they spawn the next generation. So this dreaming story and research shows that despite all the changes that have been made to the Barramadigal River, the eels continue to grow, to swim out to sea, to spawn, and their offsprings return home to their ancestral home. So despite all the changes and damages done to country, Indigenous ways of knowing, our ways of being and our ways of doing are practiced and shared in communities just like this one. I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and I really thank the Whitlam Institute and the Institute for Australian and Chinese arts and culture, for warmly inviting me to join the Honourable Kevin Rudd as he discusses ideas from his new book. I look forward to listening to you yarn about Australia's position in relation to China and the US, and I hope it incites new ways of thinking about current geopolitical crises amid the overwhelming news cycle. I want to conclude by my acknowledgement by sharing a Wiradjuri philosophy that my very wise pop and elders have instilled in me. Back home we say, Yidi Amara Yaramangari, and this roughly translates to remind us all that it is all of our responsibility to respect, care for and value country and community for generations to come. Mendanguwu Yanaglumwai Dijurum, may my ancestors walk with you all tonight. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matilda, for your kind and generous welcome. On behalf of all of us here tonight, let me also acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land and pay our respects to their elders past and present. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Australia's establishment of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China on the 21st of December 1972. The exchange of diplomatic relations and the recognition of China was an extraordinary achievement by the Whitlam government. It was famously preceded by Gough Whitlam's intrepid 1971 visit to China when leader of the opposition. This visit was the first contact between Australian and Chinese political leaders since 1949. This bold overture promised to recast relations between the two countries, but it was a politically risky gambit. The question of whether to recognize the legitimacy of the Communist government of China was one of the major foreign policy debates of the Cold War era. Whitlam had espoused recognition of the People's Republic of China from as early as August 1954, when he became the first member of Parliament to urge Australian recognition of China. For decades, Australia had looked to China with distrust, anxiety, and paranoia. The Whitlam government's establishment of diplomatic relations allowed a mature cultural, social, and economic relationship to develop. As Australia's relationship with China is again center stage, Whitlam's plea that we should be able to empathize with China rather than perceive it entirely from the perspective of our own insecurities seems very contemporary and prescient. Whitlam said, quote, "One of the greatest troubles in relations between China and the West is that we expect China to believe the best about our statements of intention, while we choose to believe the worst about hers. We expect understanding for our own fears, but we have never tried to understand hers. We have been obsessed by our historical experience, but we scoff at China's obsession with her own experience." The Whitlam Institute commemorates this historic visit and its impact on Australian-China relations. Gough Whitlam's strategic, respectful, and independent approach to diplomacy established a new place for Australia in the world. 50 years on, much can be drawn from this approach in how we tackle the foreign policy challenges of today. We are extraordinarily fortunate in our guests this evening. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to welcome and introduce Professor Jocelyn Chey AM, and in a few moments, to call upon the Honourable John Faulkner to introduce the Honourable Kevin Rudd AC. Professor Chey has had a stellar career in the diplomatic service and in academic life. From a position as lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Sydney, she moved to Canberra in 1973, when Australia first established diplomatic relations with China. For more than 20 years, she worked on Australia-China relations in the Department of Trade and Foreign Affairs and was posted 3 times to China and Hong Kong. From 1975 to 1978, she had a diplomatic appointment as cultural counselor in the Australian Embassy in Beijing, before taking up a position as Senior Trade Commissioner in the Australian Embassy in Beijing from 1985 to 88, and finally as Consul General in Hong Kong from 1992 to 1995. Now, during this time, she was instrumental in helping lay the foundations for trade and cultural relations between China and Australia. She was the key administrative officer in the Australia-China Council at the time of its founding in 1979. From 1988 to 1992, she worked outside the public sector as director of the China branch of the International Wool Secretariat. Now retired from public service, Jocelyn is a visiting professor at the University of Sydney, a consultant in Australia-China relations, and is a founding director and adjunct professor of the Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture Foundation here at Western Sydney University. Professor Chey is a China expert. She's a longtime friend of Mr. Rudd and the perfect conversationalist for this evening. Professor Chey, you are most welcome. May I please now invite the Honourable John Faulkner to introduce the Honourable Kevin Rudd, AC. John.
Well, thanks very much, John. I always think the easiest introduction of Kevin Rudd would be just to quote our special guest's own words of self-introduction with a little twist for the third-person pronoun. His name's Kevin, he's from Queensland, and he's here to help. But I'm not going to do that. And I'm also not going to adopt the approach of former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, whose legacy, of course, we honour at the Whitlam Institute. After being appointed Australia's ambassador to UNESCO, Gough was asked about his knowledge and understanding of UNESCO's work. His response to the journalist was just great. "Young lady, neither you nor I have the time for that long an interview." Well, today we're very lucky to have the time to benefit from Kevin Rudd's experience and wisdom, the experience and wisdom of another former Prime Minister. And we're very lucky to benefit from his unparalleled expertise on China, which has developed and grown over decades of study, research, diplomacy, analysis and engagement, often at the very highest international level. I had my own experience of this when General Guo, the Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission of the PRC, visited Australia in 2010 when I was the Defence Minister. And I believe that General Guo was the most senior PRC official to visit Australia prior to President Xi's visit in 2014. And as is the nature of such visits, after an exchange of pleasantries, 8 of us retired into a special meeting room for an official dialogue. You look terribly worried, Kevin, there about what I'm going to say. Please, please, you should be. No. Now, I want to assure Kevin that I'm not able, because of confidentiality concerns, to actually let you know what happened inside that room. Well, actually, I don't know what happened. The meeting lasted about 25 minutes. It was conducted entirely in Mandarin. The only one person present, yours truly, was clueless about what was said or the outcome of the meeting. And I do think, to be honest with you, sitting in a room trying to appear interested when you understand not one word uttered by any other participant for nearly half an hour is a very good test of character. I don't know whether I passed that test or not, but I do recall saying to Kevin as we left the meeting, in somewhat more fruity language that I'm going to share with you, I said, I think you really stuffed that up. And Kevin just chuckled as we walked away, but it was one of those experiences you have in politics. But it's important to understand that we should be under no illusions about how important the capacity for engagement Kevin had. It was quite unique, quite unprecedented for a head of government in our nation's experience, and I think more broadly in the international community, to engage in that way. And can I say to you, Kevin, that we're very grateful that you are sharing with us some of your recent thinking and analysis about the risk of war between China and the United States, and the challenges Australia faces with its own relationship into the future with China. And as John has said, this is particularly so in 7 days, of course. We celebrate the 50th anniversary of the election of the Whitlam government, and as you've heard, the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China just 19 days later, on the 21st of December 1972. We're delighted, Kevin, that you're able to join us this evening. It's an honour for the Whitlam Institute, and it's an honour for Western Sydney University to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd.
Thank you very much, and I too honour the first Australians on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. John, the reason that I took half an hour with the then Vice Chairman of the Military Commission, Guo Boxiong, to engage in dialogue in Chinese, it took me half an hour to explain to him how tall, handsome and intelligent you were. And as you know, you don't constitute a short essay. So by the time we got through to each chapter of your political career, our time was up. So when you said you really stuffed it up, that was a paean of praise in Chinese about you. The E.G. Whitlam, it's so good to be here to honour this man, this extraordinary man, after whom this institute is named. And Catherine, his daughter, his only daughter, I would simply like to honour Gough personally and Margaret in front of you. He's such a seminal change agent in the history of this nation. Thank you. To Jocelyn Chey, who I've known for decades now since we worked together in Beijing in the Mesolithic period. That was the 80s. And I haven't changed a bit, nor has Jocelyn. But we did good things together in those early days of the Australia-China relationship. But I'd also like to honour, Jocelyn, your scholarship and your contribution to Australian diplomacy in what also provided at that time difficult challenges as well. And to all of our friends at the University of Western Sydney, Therese and I have an enormous soft spot for this university. Therese actually holds an honorary doctorate from this university, and she holds this institution in the highest regard. And the founding vision of this university, which is to make educational opportunities open for all, not just for some, but for all, consistent with the Whitlam vision for the nation's future, including poor kids from a rural background in rural Queensland like me, to extend that vision here to this vast patch of Greater Western Sydney, says much about Gough and his vision for the future and much about this great university. So I congratulate the university for what you have done. I've been given 10 minutes to explain the vision splendid on the sunlit plains extended about where to now between China and the United States. Can I do this first by simply explaining what I've been doing since I left these shores some 6 or 7 years ago, and why I've come to write this book entitled The Avoidable War. When I left, I went to the US and ended up as president of the Asia Society. The Asia Society was established in 1956 by John D. Rockefeller III to build relations between the United States and the emerging countries and economies of Asia. And this was barely 3 years after the end of the Korean War. It was midpoint between the first and second Taiwan Straits crises. And on top of that, it was 6 or 7 years before the first hostilities in Vietnam. This institution has sought to build those relations over a very long period of time, through good times and in bad. And my job was to establish its first formal think tank. And we began as a start-up, and now we have a staff of 50 or 60, focusing purely on Asia. And within that, we've now become one of the largest think tanks dedicated to the study of China in the United States. And so we take pride in our achievements as an institution, but it is why professionally I have remained engaged on the great questions of China's future, its impact on the world, and its impact on us as Australians as well. As part of that, I decided that it was important to try and understand Xi Jinping. I'd met him in Canberra. I have met him a number of times in Beijing. And the question I'm asked most often in the world is, who is this man? What does he believe in? What is his plan for his country, for the future, in the world, in the region, and as it affects us? And what should we do about it? So in one of the most foolish things I've done in my life, in 2017-18, I enrolled in a DPhil at Oxford. I have just graduated from Oxford after 5 years of study. And the title of my... No, it's not to invite applause. That is simply to say, my God, what a foolish thing that was. But, and if you look at our class photographs from our graduating college, there am I sitting as the Ancient of Days with all these bright young things. My college, by the way, was Jesus College, John, Jesus College, Oxford. And the reason I chose Jesus, you'll appreciate this, somewhat reflective of Gough, who once described himself as a fellow traveller of Jesus. I wanted an email address which had kevin.rudd@jesus. And I now have. But the subject of the thesis is defining Xi Jinping's ideological worldview, which I've just completed. It's now with Oxford University Press, and you'll see it in some form, published form, next year. In the midst of all that, I became deeply anxious about the emerging shape of the US-China relationship. which is why I then took 6 months out of my doctoral studies to write this book on the Avoidable War, which is purely about US-China relations. China's role in the rest of the world, but largely about US-China relations, as it is the big strategic factor which influences us all. And the thesis of the book, which I will now come to, is relevant to our discourse in this country and in all countries, whether they are friends, partners and allies of the United States or friends and partners of the People's Republic of China. Right now, whether we like it or not, there is a strategic competition between the United States and China. It's clear. It doesn't matter what language is used to describe it, there is such a competitive race underway. And the object of the competition is which country emerges as the preeminent power in our region and the world by mid-century. Both sides are cagey about the way they describe this, but if you look at the entrails of military strategy, you look at the entrails of their economic strategies, what is happening in the great technological race between them, and the unfolding ideological discourse distributed by each about the future shape of the international system, this competition is on in earnest. The Americans call it such, they call it strategic competition. Our Chinese friends prefer not to call it that. But when you look at the essence of it, that is what is at stake. Some have asked, how did it get to this? And I think there's a couple of factors at play which we need to be very mindful of. The first is, from a realist view of the world, there is an unfolding balance of power between China and the United States across the Taiwan Straits. China wishes to reunite with Taiwan under a single Chinese sovereignty. Taiwanese don't want that, and the United States is supportive of Taiwan maintaining the status quo. So, analysing carefully the unfolding dynamics of the physical balance of power between China and the United States and Taiwan and other US allies in the region is one big driving factor underpinning the current dynamics in the US-China relationship. And that balance of power has been shifting slowly but inexorably in China's favour, militarily, economically, in trade, in capital flows, in technology, depending on the category of technology that we are talking about. And this, therefore, has caused this competitive relationship to rise much closer to the surface. The second driving factor underneath all of this is the fact that Xi Jinping himself, as China's leader since the end of 2012, 10 years ago last month, 10 years ago this month, has changed China's strategic course. Deng Xiaoping, China's former leader, and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who replaced him, had an axiom about how China should conduct itself in the world, which in Chinese was very simple. Hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. And underneath that, there was a doctrine which Deng Xiaoping enunciated to the party internally, which is that China's foreign and security policies should be servants of its national economic policy. And that is that China should develop its economy, become a strong global economy, and then over time gradually increase its foreign policy footprint in the region and the world. That was very much Deng Xiaoping's, very much Jiang Zemin's, very much Hu Jintao's strategy. As of the party's central work conference on foreign affairs, and in November, December of 2014, Xi Jinping changed strategic course. He did so formally. He did so in explaining to the party's entire international policy establishment, military, foreign policy, the intelligence apparatus, and the rest, that China was now going to embrace a new strategy of 分发有为, or striving for achievement. And the object of striving for achievement was to change the reality on the ground in order to change the international and regional status quo in a direction more compatible with Chinese interests and more consistent globally with Chinese values. And so that too has been an animating force in the structural changes we see at play in US-China relations over the last decade or so. Number one, a change in the objective balance of power between them in China's favour. Number two, Xi Jinping departing course from his predecessor in order to reach out and to change the status quo. Which brings me to the third driving factor underneath all of the above, which is the United States' decision as of about 2017 to change strategic course in response. And it was in November of 2017 that then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster enunciated a new national security strategy for the United States entitled Strategic Competition. And his conclusion was that the old strategy of strategic engagement with China, albeit strategic engagement with hedge, which was predicated on the idea of incorporating China fully within the international economic system, fully within the international political system, in order that when China did emerge as the world's largest economy, it would work within the rules of the system as it already existed. That was the assumption. In fact, it didn't have an assumption that China would become a democracy, though that is often said. That was ultimately a decision for the Chinese system and the Chinese people themselves. It did have an assumption that it would become part of what then US Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick said in 2005 of becoming a stakeholder in the international economic system as it had existed and unfolded since 1945. So the United States concluded that Xi Jinping's change of strategic course meant that China was now headed in a different direction and was beginning to establish an international system over time with its own Chinese characteristics, and that therefore America's centrality to the pre-existing system was under direct challenge and threat. So the Americans changed course themselves. And since the election of the Biden administration, this strategic doctrine of competition has itself become entrenched on a bipartisan basis in the United States. If you look carefully at Secretary of State Blinken's enunciation of the administration's China strategy, which he did at an event which I hosted in Washington with the Asia Society in May of this year, if you look at Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor's new national security strategy of September of this year, and the new national defence strategy of just last month, together with the new set of export controls imposed by the United States against China on high technology exports, most particularly semiconductors, this frame of strategic competition is now entrenched in the US body politic. So the reason I begin our discussion this evening by saying, why are we having this competition, this strategic competition, is that there are animating factors at work. Change in the balance of power, moving in China's direction. Change in Chinese national strategy under Xi Jinping, changing the status quo, regionally and globally. And a US decision to respond strategically by changing course on its own part, encapsulated in this doctrine of strategic competition. So to conclude these remarks before we go to the conversation with Jocelyn, the purpose of the book is not to challenge that reality, because it is the reality. I could wish it was different. It's not. So I'm not in the business of sprinkling Scandinavian fairy dust across the top in the hope that everyone hops in the jacuzzi and tomorrow morning has a better understanding of each other and it's all right by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Regrettably, international relations doesn't quite work that way. It's a hard, realist business. Instead, the argument I put is a much more simple one. It says, at present we have unmanaged strategic competition, and it's dangerous. There are no rules of the road under unmanaged strategic competition. There are no strategic guardrails. Increasingly, it's been a free-for-all for the last 5 years. Planes are almost colliding with each other, naval vessels almost colliding with each other, rolling crises in and around Taiwan, rolling exchanges between Japanese and Chinese forces in the East China Sea over Senkaku Diaoyudao, challenges to the question of maritime claims in the South China Sea between China and the 6 ASEAN claimant states on the other, rolling clashes on the Sino-Indian border, and invisible to us all, this rolling battle in cyber and space, which happens virtually every day of the week, and becoming increasingly sharp. The problem with each of those things is they are capable of triggering any day of the week war by accident through incident, escalation, crisis, conflict, war, turbocharged by nationalism on either side of the equation, Chinese or American. And if we are sober students of international relations, we will conclude that in fact there are too many precedents for this littered across the tawdry pages of international relations history. The alternative, which is the subject of this book, is what I call managed strategic competition. What do I mean by that? Again, it's not sprinkling Scandinavian pixie dust across the top. It's saying, at present, neither side, in my analysis, and most people would concur with it at this stage at least, neither side has an interest in war by design. There's a reason for that. Over Taiwan, each side fears that it might lose because the balance of power is still so tight between them. Therefore, the question I ask is, therefore, how can we reduce the risk of war by accident in the period ahead? I argue, therefore, in the book for a set of strategic guardrails, rules of the road, a set of principles within a framework of managed strategic competition which make it possible to navigate this relationship between the two sides. This would have to occur within the 5 major conflict zones of Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, cyber and space. The second component of managed strategic competition is on the question of, if you can agree on the first with each other, then the rest of the competitive relationship between you can be conducted in non-lethal terms. You can have a competitive relationship in the rest of security policy, the rest of foreign policy, in trade and investment and technology and in ideology. And as I say in the book, may the best system win, without blowing each other's brains out on the way through, which is the risk of unmanaged strategic competition. And the third element, and I conclude on this, of managed strategic competition, is within such a joint framework to carve out sufficient political and diplomatic space for each side now to re-engage with each other and the institutions of global governance to advance global public goods together, like climate change action, like maintaining global financial and economic stability, as well as ensuring that we can do a better job next time on the question of global pandemic management than we did last time. Some would say, well, that's all terribly idealist of you, Kevin. As I say in the book, okay, might be the case, but please come up with a better idea, because I will happily shred every copy of my book if someone does. And I've had this challenge out for 6 months. I have quibbles at the margin, but no alternative construct for how we manage this mess. What I find interesting is that the Soviet Union and the United States embarked upon a similar program following their own near-death experience in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Those two countries came within a whisker of blowing themselves away, and most of the rest of us with them. And what happened in the subsequent 30 years was that despite the rolling competitive tension in that Cold War, they didn't reach that precipice again. They evolved rules of the road, they evolved some strategic guardrails, they evolved some amelioration mechanisms. And as we look at what Biden and Xi Jinping agreed to in Bali just last week, I think it's worth reflecting on. Inch by inch, I sense that both these sides are crab-walking towards a concept of managed strategic competition. Prior to that, there was no rules of the road, but now President Biden speaks in terms of the need to stabilise this strategic relationship, the need for strategic guardrails, the need for managed competition. and others would speak also of the need for rules of the road. The Chinese have found this harder to move towards, but as a think tank we deal with the Chinese government and ministers all the time because we are not aligned with one side or the other. We take our responsibility as a think tank seriously in the United States. And what I see in Xi Jinping's language is a crab walk also, now talking about the need to put protections around the strategic relationship. And furthermore, he uses the word fang hu, which is getting close towards the concept of a strategic guardrail. He's talking now for the first time about the need for the bilateral relationship to have an anquan wang, a security safety net underneath the overall relationship, and to quote him or paraphrase him, to prevent crisis and conflict. And furthermore, he's commissioned and Biden has accepted senior level officials led by the US Secretary of State to begin the negotiation of these. Will it work? I don't know. But we are in a somewhat better position this week than we were prior to last week, because there has been a resolve on both their parts to move towards an attempt to stabilise this relationship. The long-term challenge of Taiwan remains. This may see us through the next several years, but whether it sees us through the ultimate question of Xi Jinping's judgment come the late 20s and early 30s that the time has come to move on Taiwan is an entirely separate question. That would be a question of war by design, not war by accident, for which the response must be continued amplification of deterrence so that the Chinese military commanders at the end of the day conclude doing that would still be far too risky for them. I thank you for your attention.
卢科文你好，好久不见了。
我还活着，我还没有去看马克思，还没有去看马克思，是40多年吗？
我们可以继续讲中文的，不管那个懂不懂。
这个老部长他们都不懂，但是我们老干部他们一直说汉语，好不好？We just said again, John, you're very tall, very intelligent, and very good looking.
Well, it's really been quite a week for both of us, I think. I know your book has had many, many launches. This week, I've been taking part also in a workshop at the ANU about the contributions to scholarship by Dr. Pierre Ryckmans, who was, I think, your lecturer when you were studying China.
Supervisor.
Supervisor, yes. Supervisor of your doctoral thesis. It leads me to the first question I was thinking ask you as I've just come from that workshop. Why? I'm sure lots of people ask you, but what was it that prompted you to take up the study of Chinese and an interest in Chinese culture?
A lack of fascination for a career in Queensland animal husbandry. That was the alternative career path for me. It's a pretty simple thing. We're all influenced by our mothers. Most of us are, anyway. And in my case, I grew up on a farm in rural Queensland, and it was a perfectly happy, bucolic life. But sitting on a horse one day with my father, he asked me whether my future would be beef or dairy. And I thought, maybe not. And I was only about 10 at the time. And Mum simultaneously would just feed me books. So I used to just disappear and read. So I began reading books about, actually, architecture. And I remember this book on classical architecture, which up the back had these couple of pages on classical Chinese architecture, roofs. And I thought, this is really interesting. And then when China entered the United Nations in 1971, was readmitted to the United Nations as the People's Republic of China, my mother walked into my room and handed me that day's paper, with the headline, "China takes seat in the UN." And my mum, who'd never been to high school, she was a nurse during the war, said, "This will change the world." There you go. And so that was a long time ago. Then I watched with rapt fascination on our black and white television in rural Queensland, Catherine, as Gough did what Gough did in 71 and 72. And I thought, whatever he's doing, I'd like to do that. And here's the final part, which brings these narratives together. As a 15-year-old, I wrote to the Australian Foreign Minister, E.G. Whitlam. As you know, Gough was not just Prime Minister, but for the first season was also Foreign Minister. He didn't trust any of his colleagues to be Foreign Minister. And I said, "Dear Mr. Whitlam, this are the subjects I'm doing at school. I think I'd like to be a diplomat one day. What should I do? Yours sincerely, Kevin from Queensland." I'm 15 years old, right? And then this letter comes back from Gough, signed, see that signature down there? Signed with that signature, saying, "Dear Kevin, thank you for your letter. I encourage you in your studies. You should really study a foreign language, preferably an Asian language. And then I would encourage you then to go to university and apply to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Yours sincerely, E.G. Whitlam, Foreign Minister and Prime Minister of Australia." And being a good Queenslander, we just take orders from above.
Yeah. To get back to Pierre Ryckmans, a remarkable scholar. So he was, as you said, he was the supervisor of your doctoral thesis.
Honours thesis.
Your honours thesis.
Honours thesis.
On the central figure of the 1978 democracy war, Wei Jingshen, who was an advocate of what he called the fifth modernization. So how did you come to choose that topic? And do you think that it was a good introduction to start with this sort of anti-establishment, dissident philosophy? Or has it in fact coloured your view of China since then?
The reason I chose that as the thesis, which I wrote in 1980, was because, as you know, you had this extraordinary and tumultuous period of political change in China between the death of Mao in September of 76, the rehabilitation for the third time of Deng Xiaoping in 77, 78, accompanied by, of course, the purge of the Gang of Four and those around them. What fascinated me was, to be honest, not so much Wei Jingsheng, the individual, but what fascinated me was the surrounding domestic politics of China at the time, as it left the Cultural Revolution model of domestic politics and sought to embrace a more regular form of politics, and the massive internal convulsions within the party in that 76-79 period. And most of the thesis deals with that. I did translate Wei Jingsheng's trial in full. It was smuggled out to Ming Bao in Hong Kong. Got a hold of the text, and then no one had put it into English at that stage, so I did. But the principal prism of interest was to understand the power dynamics of the Chinese Communist Party.
So moving on then, we both found ourselves in Beijing in 1985, when the ambassador was the eminent development economist Ross Garnaut, and he was a very close advisor to Bob Hawke, and he had quite a vision for how relations between Australia and China might develop. He saw that our economies were, use his term, complementary, and that further engagement with China and with Northeast Asia, including Korea and Japan, would be to the advantage of all the parties concerned. So there seemed to be, at that time, a great many opportunities to doing things. We were not short of initiatives. And it was also a time when visiting ministers from Canberra would almost had to be cautioned not to be too enthusiastic about the potential for development. So there were also on the Chinese side, I think there were some quite enthusiastic people who responded to the opportunities, including Hu Yaobang, who came to visit Australia, and Zhao Ziyan. And you mentioned in your book that you met Hu Yaobang when he visited the embassy. I can remember that dinner too. I also remember his return invitation after his visit to Australia. I don't remember, were you at that rather small
Can't quite
occasion?
remember.
Yeah. He was, I guess not pushing it too far, say he was an eccentric individual. Somebody, for instance, who thought that chopsticks were not hygienic, and the dinner was served with Western style, with the portions already placed on plates and to be eaten with knife and fork. That's a small indication of his particularity. I wonder if you have any more stories about Hu Yaobang or Zhou Ziyang that you might share with us.
Yeah, certainly I was part of both those sets of visits. Hu Yaobang, I didn't come to Australia with him, obviously, because I was in the embassy in Beijing, but I do remember the farewells in Beijing. And I remember all the other Chinese government ministers who came to the residence at the embassy, that you couldn't move for the number of food tasters who were there. Because in the great tradition of Chinese elite politics, you're always frightened of the emperor being poisoned. And so there were just food tasters everywhere. What's your job? I'm a food taster. Okay, good. And so there was this bucket load of food tasters. That's one small memory. What I remember, building on your recollection of Hu Yaobang's modest eccentricity, was when we went to Sichuan. Did you come out to Chengdu with us?
No, I wasn't here.
So I was doing the advancing in Chengdu, and Chengdu in those days, and here we're talking about 1985. This was Hawke's visit to China, 86, after the Hu Yaobang visit. But Hu Yaobang is still General Secretary of the party, and we get out to Chengdu, and Chengdu in those days was 比较落后, and it was a little backward. Like there was nothing going on in Chengdu. A couple of pandas, and that was about it. And we were encouraging Hawke and the Australian business community to take Western China seriously. But what I remember was the dinner at whichever leadership compound we were at, where you're absolutely right, at the dinner, there was Hu Yaobang hosting with this massive set of Western cutlery. So, as you know, if you're having a Chinese meal, you've got one set of chopsticks, and then you just pile food onto your plate. Well, Hu Yaobang, believing that we had to be respectful to the Westerners, for every single Chinese dish had a new knife and fork. So you'd sit down, and there's like this ocean of forks and ocean of knives out the either side of either plate. It was kind of fun. So, but I remember him being a live wire enthusiast for Australia. Any Kiwis in this room? New Zealanders? Good, I'm about to be insulting. So Hu Yaobang pronounced to the Australians, he said, 澳中双方关系是丰富多彩，澳新关系是比较无聊。 He said Australia relations are full of diversity and different tastes and flavours. There's a lot going on. He said the New Zealand relationship's pretty boring. So my Kiwi cousins never got over that when we briefed them in full on the conversation.
Well, of course, both Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang fell foul of factionalism within the Chinese Communist Party, which seems to be a continuing feature of perhaps particularly of a one-party state. But even in our own politics, people can fall foul of factionalism, and you and others...
Who are you talking about? God, never get your friends to interview you. Yeah, Faulkner, what were you doing that night?
Do you think that factionalism is an inevitable in politics? And do you think that perhaps it's the guarding against factionalism that is one of the driving forces of Xi Jinping's current policies?
Well, as you know, the whole Chinese term for faction is a negative term. Even back in Chinese classical history, the whole idea of factions in the Chinese court was something which was 斗不好. And so, and certainly in the contemporary period as well, the number of people, the daily editorials have been written in the last 75 years warning about factionalism. Okay, so you warn about factionalism because it exists and has long existed within the Chinese Communist Party. In many respects, I think because the Communist Party does not have the automatic stabilizers of a regular election, we have a regular election in Western democracies, which is whatever you think of the mob in power or the mob who are not in power, ultimately the legitimacy process is sorted out through the ballot box. We go and vote, for good or for ill, there's a new government, and outside of the United States, everyone accepts the result. January 6th. The Chinese Communist Party, being a revolutionary Leninist party, doesn't accept that principle at all. They regard we on the centre-left in Australia as a bunch of soft, sentimental parliamentarians. It's a split that goes back to the Second International in 1886. But in the Chinese Communist Party, because there is no regular, as it were, mechanism to sort out success and failure, then it does become a brutal factional struggle for power internally. That's the truth of it. Mao ran a constant series of factional campaigns against those who he designated to be rightists and splittists, and that's before 49. Look what happened at Yan'an, quite apart from what happened in the Fan You, the anti-rightist campaign. And then subsequently, in his fight back after his failure in the Great Leap Forward. Roll the clock on. After the Cultural Revolution, there was a fight back from the other faction, which is concerned about the success of the economy rather than the purity of Marxist-Leninist politics, led by Deng, led by Jiang, led by Hu, and led by, let's call it, the Communist Youth League faction, all of whom wanted to reprioritise economic growth rather than class purity. And so they prevailed for the better part of the next 35 years. And Xi Jinping now has reservations about the predominance of that group, which is why at the 20th Party Congress you see, again, the last remaining representatives of that group, Li Keqiang, Hu Chunhua and Wang Yang, removed. And therefore there is now one faction, it's called the Xi Jinping faction. He thinks.
So, thank you. We know that your book is titled about reference to Xi Jinping's China, not just China. So it's all about Xi, really. And you've already made some comments about what you think drives Xi as what motivates him. But do you think that just now, when you were reflecting on, back to Yan'an, of course, his father was a leader in the, might say, even rescued the stragglers at the end of the Long March. So he was there in Yan'an, and that's where the family commitment to Marxism begins there. Is that the main driver, do you think, or is it a kind of patriotism and nationalism?
Often in the China analytical world, outside of China, we assume that there is a binary alternative, which is either you are a Marxist-Leninist or you're a patriotic nationalist. My thesis, the one that I've just written, is that Xi Jinping is both. I describe his 世界观, his worldview, as being one of Marxist nationalism. Now, as a matter of logic, that is a problem because Marxists are internationalists, not nationalists. But as you know, Marxist-Leninism, even as applied by Mao in the earliest days of the party, after he assumed control of the system from about Zuni Conference on, from about 1935-36 onwards. If you read the early documents, it's both about ideology and it's about the party being equipped to, uniquely equipped to realize China's national salvation. So I see Xi Jinping as very much being in that Mao tradition of Marxist nationalism. He's moving to the left on Leninism, moving to the left on Marxism as far as politics and the economy is concerned, but he's moving much more assertively on nationalism and China's foreign policy and security policy remit. So that's why I call him a Marxist nationalist.
There's a preference in Chinese thinking or writing to make numbered lists of things. I think everybody, it's now become sort of standard in English. We all know about the Gang of Four. Perhaps we don't know about some of the other numbered lists, with for instance, the 5 poisons or the 6 arts of the gentleman and so on. And in modern history...
Fooker and I were the Gang of 2 in our government.
The Gang of... In modern history, we've had Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations. Jiang Zemin had the 3 represents. And Xi Jinping has the 2 establishes. And I think perhaps you may have caught this virus from China, because in your book you've got the 10 circles of Xi Jinping's political concerns.
That's because I wanted to be bigger than all of them.
And then you've got 10 scenarios for possible solutions. Were you conscious that you were adopting this kind of Chinese formulaic, or do you naturally think like that?
Well, you know something, Jocelyn? Descartes was not Chinese, and he thought in numerical sequence as well. And I'm a member of the Western Academy. I'm not part of the Chinese Academy. No, I just enumerate, as Faulkner will remember from multiple cabinet meetings, because I find it easier to remember. And furthermore, there is so much what I describe as sludge written about contemporary China that I'd much rather crystallize the arguments in manners which people can grasp, accept or reject, rather than just wallowing around in conceptual marshmallow.
Well, I've found another list which is buried in your book but not completely obvious, so I'd like to offer it to you. And that is, your book is about the 3 traps. The first one that you mention is the Thucydides trap. And the second one that you mention is the middle income trap. And the third one that you mention is the debt trap, particularly in China's Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know if you were conscious that you have these 3 traps scattered through your book. I mean, I think they're all very significant and they're all validly included in the book. I wondered if you'd ever thought of them as like in a series like that.
I certainly am conscious of each of them and as elucidated in the book, but they all deal with different parts of one aggregate reality. Thucydides' trap is about geopolitics. The middle income trap is obviously about China's economic trajectory. And the debt trap is systemic to all economies. When you elevate borrowings as a percentage of GDP, that you get to a point of nascent financial instability. So, the first trap on geopolitics is clear. Allison's book, Graham Allison's book, called Thucydides, he doesn't call it Thucydides' trap, he calls it Destined for War, written in 2015. That's why I called mine The Avoidable War, because Graham Allison's book in the United States became a meme, and congressmen began to imbibe this meme that we were destined for war. And I'd go, oh, no, 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 no. And that's why I took 6 months out to write the counter-narrative. Under Thucydides' trap, it's based on, of course, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars, classical Sparta, classical Athens, rising powers, established powers, and what happens in their respective behaviours as the pre-existing balance is upset to the point where you can either see preemptive action from either side. So, the analogies with the United States and China, of course, are clear. On the debt trap, the Chinese have been worried about that for a long time because of the history of Latin America. Economic development reaching a certain per capita income, middle income status, usually $12,000 a year, and for some reasons, in many countries around the world, stagnates at that and doesn't break through into advanced economy status, often because of questions of productivity, as you know. And the final one on debt, there is a less robust set of mathematics about it, but at what point does your debt to GDP ratio cause inherent instabilities within your domestic credit markets to the point that they freeze, irrespective of whether you have international credit markets at work simultaneously through that debt being dollar denominated or foreign currency denominated, which is not the case in China. But if you were to sit around a table of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, all three of these challenges are perceived, reflected on, and being responded to, which is why I use the terms in the book.
I think we've time for just one last question, and I'd like to turn to the question of human rights, which is becoming more and more prominent, not only in international diplomacy, relations with China, with other countries, for instance with Iran at the moment, but also in trade. Just to give one example, there is a lot of discussion at the moment about solar panels which are made of polycarbonate, which is produced in Xinjiang under its claimed forced labour conditions. And that's a question of what we do about it's almost impossible to verify once a product goes into the international trade market. You don't know which part of it has been produced under forced labour conditions and which parts of it are acceptable. So it's becoming an extremely complicated issue in trade, quite apart from the issues that might be raised in bilateral diplomatic relations. We seem to have a particular problem with China's policies towards the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, Muslim minorities in Xinjiang province. How do you think that these issues should best be addressed?
Well, any framework for Australian strategy towards China will automatically incorporate human rights. It's not a question of choice, because if we choose to ignore that, we cease to be Australian, and we are part of a universal human rights tradition. It's not a function of being from, quote, the West, unquote. And the reason I say that is because Australia in 1948 signed and ratified the Universal Declaration. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 was drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt, and part of her drafting committee was senior representatives of the then nationalist government of China and the then Indian government of China. The idea that this was a Western construct, the 1948 document, is empirically wrong. And if you look carefully at its drafting and the autobiographical reflections on its drafting, this was not an attempt to reflect, the United States Constitution in an international instrument, and it doesn't. So when we talk loosely about human rights, I'm always of a mind that we go back to the foundational documents, because China has ratified that document. Australia has ratified that document. In the 1960s, there were two further documents, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China has signed but not ratified, which we have signed and ratified. And the third document is the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, which both Australia and China have signed and ratified. So you put that together, that's the fabric of international law on human rights. So therefore, my argument is that rather than sort of pick and choose what you care to identify as being the problem du jour, that we anchor all of our engagement with our Chinese friends in the international instruments, because that's the universal benchmark. And against that universal benchmark, you would say that the Chinese have achieved extraordinary success in the economic rights of the Chinese people by lifting them out of poverty. And they have. It's a remarkable achievement. 700 million people out of poverty. Now, that is extraordinary. At the same time, on civil and political rights, the truth is that if you're from Tibet and from Xinjiang, and if you are a Tibetan or a Uyghur, then you do not have the same ability to exercise the same freedoms if you're a Han Chinese. Now, the incarceration of Uyghurs is on a large scale, as documented by the Human Rights Council investigatory report recently concluded. My argument is that is part of an Australian strategy. It is one part. The others are our alliance with the United States, which doesn't mean compliance with the United States on every item of US foreign policy. The other part of our strategy for managing the China relationship is working hard to advance trade, investment, and economic engagement to each side's advantage. Fourthly, to work with our Chinese friends in the global institutional arrangements through the G20, through the UN, through the UNMCCC on climate change, on global financial stability, which we did in the global financial crisis. I spent so much time on the phone with Chinese leaders during that crisis, helping to deliver the outcome which we produced in the G20 summit in London in March of 2009. And if there's a final principle, which I often talk about, it's if you're going to disagree with China, then a piece of strategic wisdom is this, if you're Australians. You know the classic Chinese aphorism, sha yi jing bai, okay, which is kill one to warn 100. Now, that dope Morrison and here is a totally partisan comment, but empirically justified. That dope Morrison never understood sha yi jing bai. And so what does he do? He goes out in unilateral position on the question of a global investigation, the origins of COVID-19. Nothing wrong with that. I had co-authored a similar request as a former Prime Minister in an open letter in the New York Times with 100 other former heads of government. Okay? So there was no sha yi jing bai because they're already yi jing yo bai. There was already 100 others. So if you're going to part company with China, just be a bit pragmatic about it. Take time, bring together a coalition of governments in Asia, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, and advance that as a common position and say to our Chinese friends, we don't agree with this way forward, and here are the reasons why, and we have this position collectively. Much harder to have your head blown off like Morrison did. What a dope.
Well, thank you very much. We do now have some time for some questions from the audience. And we have two microphones, one here, and Ran is going to go to that side, and one here from Amita. Now, by show of hands, thank you. Can I have Ran have a question here? We'll take three at a time. So one here, and Ran. Questions in the front here, and the gentleman there. So can I have this question here first, please?
So I just got a question because we all know that she is completely in power. And my question is, what can we really do as an international society to stop it from happening? Because as you mentioned that she definitely wants to reunite China, and the Taiwanese don't like it. But also I think it's a large amount of people in China. They also want China to be reunited under the Republic of China banner, rather than PRC banner. Of course, their voice are always ignored, or it's not that allowed, because it's not allowed. But however, as an international society, what can we do to stop it?
Thank you. Can we have the question here, please?
Hi, good evening, Kevin, and thank you. Appreciate all you've done for Australia. And I'm just thinking about what you said about, I don't know, was it fairy dust or something, that we need to sprinkle fairy dust down? And you seem to make it sound like something that's impossible and impractical. But when I heard you talking about the origin of the human rights with those three people you mentioned, it seems like that is the basis of that fairy dust that we need to sprinkle down. And how can we really get practical about this and bring it down?
Thank you. And we have one final question from the gentleman here. Can we get the microphone to him, please?
Mr. Rudd, I really appreciate your concern about the possibility of the avoidable war actually happening and how to get away from it. One thing I've realized recently about the Australian situation is that it's just a small number of people who decide whether Australia goes to a war that's not a defensive war. And that small number of people might include a former prime minister that you just referred to and a few other people. So I wonder what is it going to take for the Parliament to start taking responsibility for deciding about going to wars which are not defensive, but are, as I've heard the term, wars of choice, where you go somewhere else and join in a war that's really not about your own territory. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. On the first question, which is what can we do about the dynamics of Taiwan, and you're right to say that as China's stated policy since 1949 to reunite with Taiwan, it is equally right to observe that in the terms of diplomatic recognition with the United States in 1972 and in the communiques of that year, Shanghai 79 and 82, that the United States has never accepted that reunification should occur by armed force, but by negotiation. And that formed the basis of, let's call it the common position on the one China policy. And that has always been my approach, and it should be the approach of every future Australian government. There is one China, and the idea that there could ever be a future Republic of Taiwan is itself such a fundamentally, strategically destabilising argument that it destroys what the Taiwanese people themselves want, which is to maintain the status quo. That is my view, that the objective of policy should be to maintain the status quo, unless our friends in Taiwan decide they want to become part of a broader confederation with the People's Republic of China at some future point, which enables them to pursue their own form of, shall we say, provincial autonomy. So that's kind of my view. Now, how do you do it? I think there are two things that are in the world of real policy, maybe three. The first is the argument outlined in the book and in articles I've written and now partly reflected in the discourse of the two countries is manage your competitive relationship in a manner which reduces the risk of war by accident. And what can the rest of us do? The international community is now urging both China and the United States to do that. And if you look carefully at their statements in Bali, both of them referred to the urgings of the international community to manage the relationship strategically in a more stable fashion. So these propositions do not fall entirely on deaf ears. They know that there is a wider court of international opinion looking carefully at this. And what I've suggested here is a framework through which you do it. And variations on a theme, I think, are reflected in the way in which the two sides may seek to take that forward for what I call the short to medium term. Second point is, for the medium to long term, you still run up against the hard question of does China still intend to use force to obtain Taiwan when it feels that the military and economic balance is more advantageous for itself. And there, the responsibility for all of us who do not want that to occur is to continue to build forms of persuasive deterrence, military, financial, economic, political and in foreign policy terms, with a wide coalition of states in order to cause Chinese military and economic leaders in the late 20s and the early 30s to conclude that the risk is still too great. The third thing I think should be done is our Taiwanese friends need to be encouraged much more forcefully to resume a political track with Beijing. At present, there is no political dialogue between the two sides. The technical reason for that is that the current Taiwanese government refuses to accept the premises of what's called the 1992 Consensus. Now, that is an amorphous document in itself. For those of you who've read the 1992 Consensus, it's a bit like reading the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church. They could mean anything. Sorry, I thought you might... as an Anglo-Catholic, I've read the 39 Articles, and they can mean anything. But to allow our Taiwanese friends to think that they can just carry on regardless and not pursue a political track with Beijing to look at permutations and combinations for the future with mainland China, I think places far too much burden and far too much stress on the US relationship and on the US military relationship. Because if there's no political track between Taipei and Beijing, guess what? It automatically goes into the Washington-Beijing track, and because that diplomatic relationship has been a mess for 5 years now, it goes into the military track, hence the fireworks we see. So we need the third element of what I'd recommend is getting our Taiwanese friends to start having some speaksies. Just quickly on the other two. What I meant by pixie dust, by the way, not fairy dust, there's a technical difference, is as follows. Normative statements that if only these two countries would get together and really understand what their core interests and values are, that they could reach some magical zhongyong, some magical golden mean, some magical pinghang, some magical datong, which would bring the two sides together, is frankly fanciful. And the reason I say it's fanciful is that both these countries deeply understand the other's strategic ambitions. China wants to take Taiwan by force if necessary. America doesn't want that to happen by force. And both strategies are being aligned accordingly. China wants to become the preeminent regional and global power by mid-century. The United States doesn't want to cease the American century. So for those when I talk about fairy dust, pixie dust, it's saying, oh, I wish they would just talk more and get on better. That cannot be achieved in the midst of such a fundamental strategic competition. Therefore, my argument is, let's have some rules around the competition. And part of the continuing competition between China and the United States is over ideology, is over ideation, and therefore is over competing doctrines of rights, 权利. And Marxist-Leninist concepts of rights is vastly different for rights as defined in the liberal democratic tradition. But that's part of the contest of ideas for the wider world. And therefore, my argument is, may the best system win. I am a liberal democrat. I make no apology for that. I've said so in the early pages of this book. The Communist Party has a different view of that. And finally, on the question and the role of Parliament, and the question of going to war, as John Faulkner knows as a former Minister for Defence, on questions of going to war in, for example, Iraq, we, the Parliamentary Labour Party and the Parliamentary Opposition, formally voted against that in a resolution which was put forward by then Prime Minister John Howard. I remember speaking to the resolution as a shadow foreign minister at the time. So there are parliamentary mechanisms. Should you formally bind the executive government in times of national security duress by the aspirations of the parliament itself? I'm not prepared to reach that conclusion. It depends entirely, as they say, on the circumstances. And anyone who's occupied the position of Defence Minister in particular understands that.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Would you like to take two more questions?
Yeah, how's our time going? 'Cause
We're running, well, how long would you like to stay back and sign books is the question.
I'll take two more, that'd be great. And this is the fatal point of an evening, when you think you're doing okay, you ask a couple more questions, and then in comes the whistling exocet to take you out and leave you as a smudge on the wall. But go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rudd. We have one question here, and then after this gentleman here, Ran, we have the gentleman in the blue shirt there, and will have to be our last question. You, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Good to see you again here. I have a question that your Chinese colleague, President Xi Jinping, probably going to be running his third term very shortly.
He'll be what?
He will be running his third term of presidency.
Yeah, he started. He's doing well. He won by 2,280 votes to 0.
Yeah,
that's the vote I wanted in the caucus in 2010. And Faulkner didn't deliver the numbers.
Okay, yeah, that's what we do. I just want to ask, President Xi Jinping has got probably most powerful leader in Chinese recent history. And if you look at the names of the members of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau in China, this could be the most united administration. That will give him the confidence to take Taiwan. And we do believe that must be on his to-do list for the third term, and possibly not in a peaceful way. So I just wonder, if that happened, if China took Taiwan, US military, what consequences would China face? Does America and the Western world have the capability to cut off China from the rest of the world, economically or politically?
Okay, I got it.
Thank you. And can we have the question up there, please?
Yeah, a slightly different crowd to last night, Kevin. Your former Belfer Center colleague, Professor Xiang Lenxin, gave a talk 2 weeks ago at the Whitlam Institute where he broached the subject of what President Biden was talking about when asked directly whether they would defend Taiwan. He then alluded to, and you haven't mentioned it tonight, the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. And many other commentators at the moment are looking at the nuance and recall some of the details of the debate that then Senator Biden had and made in comments about the Taiwan Relations Act. Should we re-look at aspects of that? Part two, Professor Ian D. Henry...
Parts. I always worry about two parts.
Yeah, exactly. Part two, Professor Ian D. Henry of the ANU Strategic Studies Centre has done some original analysis on the cables and text of the negotiations on the ANZUS Treaty, and the granular detail of that shows that there was no concept that people would come to defend Taiwan. The cables from Sir Percy Spender, Allegra Spender's grandfather, made it extremely clear that there was no intention of going to war. And people will remember the time the Korean War was bubbling along and the 7th Fleet was sailing up and down the Taiwan Strait protecting Formosa, as it then was.
I think I've got it. Good. Thank you for that. I knew I should have gone early. A couple of thoughts. Essentially, the first question is how would the United States respond? And I think if it was to happen now, first point is I do not believe it is currently in Xi Jinping's planning for it to happen in his third term. The reason for that is I do not believe that the Chinese calculus about the balance of military power across the Taiwan Straits is sufficiently decisive for them to be guaranteed of winning. Remember Sun Tzu Bing Fa, the Art of War. Paragraph 1, war is a great matter of state. If you lose the war, you lose the state, unquote. Don't you love classical Chinese? Sort of boom. You know. So, and that is etched into the cerebral cortex of every single Chinese leader. And as you know from other of the 7 Chinese military classics, the other Chinese aphorism is that victory is best secured without firing a shot. So under those circumstances, I do not see a credible scenario where you would have war by design during Xi Jinping's 3rd term. I'm much more concerned about the 4th term. And the reason I'm much more concerned about the 4th term is that China's military, financial and economic and technological plan for the next 5 years is to overcome the deficiencies it currently faces in order to deliver it the overwhelming shock and awe which it believes it needs in order to not replicate the military idiocy of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. What would the United States do? Under the current Biden administration, given the 4 statements to date by President Biden, that the United States would militarily defend Taiwan, if he was still the President of the United States, I think it is inconceivable that he would not act militarily. I believe that's also the assumption of the Chinese. Number 2, what else would the United States do? It would seek to mobilize the sort of financial and trade sanctions against China from the rest of the world that is already deployed with the rest of the world against Russia, and with monumental consequences given that these are the world's 2 largest economies, not Russia, which is a relatively minor economy. Number 3, and I think this is the big variable, is over the next 5 to 10 years, what will be the composition of US presidential politics beyond the Biden administration? Will the Republicans come back? Will it be a neo-isolationist Republican Party influenced by Trumpianism, which actually is not forward-leaning on the question of alliance solidarity? Or are we post that Trumpian phase in Republican politics whereby the Republican Party returns to a more mainstream pro-alliance America in the world, not America isolationist view? That's the open question for the future, for which I cannot make a prediction. On the Taiwan Relations Act and its provisions, it's always worth reading the TRA because it's pretty robust. Remember when Carter finally extended diplomatic recognition in 1979, the Congress then turned around and legislated and said, well, thank you very much, President Carter, but here are the constraints. And Carter did not seek to veto the Taiwan Relations Act. He signed it into law. And it provides, among other things, a sufficient guarantee of military supplies for Taiwan to ensure its capacity to defend itself against Chinese mainland military aggression in the future. And it constitutes the keystone of American current strategy, together what President Biden now refers to routinely as America's 6 assurances to the Taiwanese. By the way, keep your eyes peeled on the other thing going through the Congress at the moment called the Taiwan Policy Act, the TPA, which is one of the more lunatic pieces of American legislation I have seen. It says that Taiwan should be designated in the future as an American treaty ally, and furthermore says that Taiwan's representative office in the United States should be redesignated using the Lithuanian formula as the TRO, the Taiwan Representative Office. Both of these things go to the core of the One China policy and therefore run themselves right up against the 3 communiques and therefore become, in my argument, causus belli. I think the Democrats and President Biden will seek to take out the most difficult parts of this legislation, but we are watching it very carefully as it progresses its way through the Congress. And on the ANZUS provisions, there are only 2 provisions in the ANZUS Treaty, and they are as follows, that the Australia and the United States, as the 2 contracting parties, shall consult to meet the common danger if either A, the armed forces of either contracting parties come under attack in the Pacific area, or B, if the metropolitan territory of the contracting parties is attacked. And that is a commitment to consult to meet the common danger. In the 71 years since ANZUS was announced by Percy Spender and Dean Acheson, I think, in 1951. It's only been invoked once, and that was on September 11 when the Metropolitan Territory of the United States was attacked. And that actually triggered the so-called war against terrorism. So as to its future application on any other Pacific scenario, no responsible Australian Prime Minister or former Prime Minister or Foreign Minister or former Foreign Minister or Defence Minister or former Defence Minister comments publicly on the application of the ANZUS Treaty to any future strategic scenarios. It is not a productive thing to do. And the only exception to that is the idiot Dutton, who has done so.
Well, on behalf of the Whitlam Institute and its board, thank you to our speakers for the generosity of time. And of course, thank you for your many, many insights. Understanding China's grand strategy, the order it has created, and the constraints on its exercise of power may help statesmen avoid catastrophic miscalculations and to secure further gains upon the promise of 50 years ago. Might I please invite my colleague, Professor Jing Han, the director of the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture, to the front to offer a vote of thanks to our speakers. Jing.
Thank you, John. Thank you, the Honourable Kevin Rudd, AC, and Professor Jocelyn Chey AM, for this great conversation, insightful, enlightening, and engaging. I still remember the excitement of having the first Prime Minister of Australia who is fluent in Chinese. And I worked at SBS for 23 years at SBS Subtitling. We divided people in the world into two categories. One, monolingual. Two, bilingual or multilingual, who see the world very differently. I also remember the thrill of subtitling the Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's speech in Chinese into English. And in that 5 minutes speech, the Prime Minister used the word therefore, 所以, 20 times. But today I didn't hear one time you say therefore, 所以. Those of us born Chinese are very lucky because we were born speaking Chinese, which is a very complex and intriguing language to learn. That is why Chinese people are super appreciative of Mr. Rudd and Professor Jocelyn Chey, who have learned Chinese so well. We are also very lucky to be able to claim Professor Jocelyn Chey as ours. As John introduced before, Jocelyn was the founding director of this institute, Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture, and she's currently the adjunct professor of this institute. Jocelyn's sharp mind, a wide range of knowledge, and intellectual power are hard to match. She has all our admiration and respect. She's just an inspiration. And as a token of our appreciation, John and I have little presents to present to the two speakers today. This one is a set of 5 greeting cards made of paper cards. They are all Australian flowers and plants, native one. They're made by a very famous Australian Chinese artist called Zhu Tianli, and we have exhibited her artworks. And this set of artworks is called After Black Summer. I also have this one. This is the Chinese translation of a great Australian Indigenous writer, Melissa Lukashenko. Her Miles Franklin Award winning novel, Too Much Lip. And then Chinese version that I made was published in China this year and launched in the Australian Embassy in Beijing. So I'd like to give this to Mr. Rudd, and I hope he will testify that my Chinese translation is excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.
所以我觉得很荣幸。
I have given my book to Jocelyn before, so thank you very much.
I won't hold you up much longer, but we too have a few gifts for Jocelyn Chey and Mr. Rudd. Might I also invite everyone to a reception immediately following this, where you'll have an opportunity to view the special art exhibition, A Lyrical Language by Chinese-Australian artist Wang Lan, and of course to take up your opportunity to purchase a book of the Avoidable War and to get it signed by its author. Once again, please
or
join
buy
me
many
in thank...
books, and then you get a free set of steak knives.
But once again, please join me in thank the speakers in the usual way.